Welcome everyone to Discover This. We're here in Indian Wells, California at the Eisenhower Walk of Honor, and we're going to be talking about President Dwight Eisenhower today. And the reason we're out here in the Coachella Valley is that in 1954 it's rumored that President Eisenhower met with aliens. So we're going to talk about that story and talk about all the things that went along with it, and at the end of the day you be the judge. So let's get started.
1, 2, 3, 4.
So we're talking about the time frame of February of 1954. And President Eisenhower was a president that was not known to take a lot of vacations. And on February 12th, 1954, President Eisenhower went on a hunting trip down to Georgia, quail hunting, at the property owned by his Secretary of Treasury, George Humphrey. And President Eisenhower was down there for about 36 hours hunting quail. And in addition to his Secret Service detail, he also had been assigned 6 Georgia state troopers that were part of his security detail while he was out there doing his hunting. It's quail hunting. And at the end of the 36 hours, President Eisenhower got back on his plane and went back to Washington, D.C. But then on February 17th, President Eisenhower and his wife Mamie and their entourage flew from Washington to Palm Springs, California. And they landed here at the Palm Springs Airport about 9:31 p.m. And they were met by the governor of California, the mayor of Palm Springs, and there was about 1,000 people lining the streets to wave to the motorcade after it left the airport. And President Eisenhower's entourage came here to Smoke Tree Estates in the south end of Palm Springs. It's a secured, gated community. It was back then. Here's an old photo of what it used to look like. The entrance has been modernized. Now, Eisenhower was originally going to stay at the home of Paul Hoffman, the CEO of Studebaker, but the Secret Service thought that bakery executive Paul Helms' home was better suited security-wise, so the Eisenhowers stayed at the Helms house. A small office was made up in one of the community buildings on the Smoke Tree property for Eisenhower to use. And here's a photo of President Eisenhower signing some bills in that office during his time here at Smoke Tree. And a few other photos from the Smoke Tree property here. By the way, the entourage included the 6 Georgia state troopers that had been assigned to the president at the Georgia hunting trip a week earlier. Why the need for that? Certainly, Palm Springs Police Department could do dignitary protection, or if not them, Riverside County Sheriff's Department could certainly handle that. Or if not them, then the California Highway Patrol, which is basically California's state troopers. Why the need to bring 6 Georgia state troopers out to California for dignitary protection? After everyone had cleared the airport, the president's plane took off. Now, it's rumored that the plane went to Los Angeles for some routine maintenance while the president was doing his golfing vacation. But there's also rumors that the plane was moved to another airfield out here in the Coachella Valley. There were about 3 other airfields that could have handled a plane of that size, the Columbine. For a secret trip the president was going to be taking. So on Thursday, February 18th, around 9:30 a.m., the president arrived at Tamara's Country Club right here for golf with his host Paul Helms and golfer Ben Hogan. And at 1 p.m. he had lunch with a group of others at this country club restaurant. On Friday, February 19th, around 9 a.m., President Eisenhower headed to Thunderbird Country Club for some golf. And at 1 p.m., he and a large group had lunch at the Thunderbird Country Club restaurant. So now if you look at Eisenhower's calendar, kept by the Eisenhower Presidential Library these days, it says Thunderbolt Country Club, not Thunderbird. But it was Thunderbird. After lunch, President Eisenhower was taken over to the Indio Ranch of aviator Jacqueline Cochran for a visit, and then he eventually made his way back to Smoke Tree. So on Saturday, February 20th, President Eisenhower came back to Thunderbird Country Club around 9:10 a.m. for golf. At 12:50 p.m. he had lunch with another large group at the country club restaurant, and this time he headed back to Smoke Tree. So according to his presidential calendar kept by the Eisenhower Library, it says between 8 and 10 p.m. Eisenhower broke off a cap off his front tooth and went to a dentist in Palm Springs. And as you can see on this entry here, that's it. There's no details on who the dentist was, where the dental office was, or anything. So President Eisenhower supposedly bit down on a chicken wing and broke the cap off his tooth, and he needed emergency dental repair. Supposedly a dentist was called, Dr. Francis Purcell. And this is where Dr. Purcell lived and would have received that phone call. 360 Pablo Drive. Sometimes it's referred to West Pablo or sometimes South Pablo. It's right on the curve of the road, as you can see, so we'll just go with 360 Pablo. So Dr. Purcell got a phone call shortly before 8 p.m. on Saturday night, February 20th, 1954, and he would have left from here to go to his dental office to meet his patient. Reportedly, the phone call didn't include who his patient was, just that it was an emergency for someone important. Dr. Purcell would have reported here to his dental office at 700 North Palm Canyon in Palm Springs. And this is where President Eisenhower would have been brought to have his cap repaired. Now, Dr. Purcell didn't keep any records of this visit, nothing in his files or on his calendar, no notes. There had been a press conference scheduled for Saturday evening, February 20th, with President Eisenhower. He was a no-show, so the press corps was growing impatient with no President Eisenhower, and the White House staff kept putting the press corps off, not explaining the delay. It got to the point that rumors started, and one rumor was that President Eisenhower had died from a heart attack, a rumor that the Associated Press actually put to print and released on the wires all around the country. The White House staff freaked out and said, no, the president was not dead. He was having emergency dental work done in Palm Springs. The AP story was retracted after about 2 minutes, but the damage was done. The dental story seemed like a last-minute cover story. As you can see from this calendar entry, there's very few details about this visit. No exact time, no exact leaving time, who the doctor was, the location. Unlike all the other entries in his calendar that were very detailed. All right, so the alternate version of this story is that President Eisenhower was whisked away from Smoke Tree Ranch to his airplane, which was not at the Palm Springs Airport, remember, and flown to Edwards Air Force Base, formerly Muroc Air Base. The name was changed in 1949. Now that's where the president reportedly met with extraterrestrials in a secured hangar just off the flight line. Now, in addition to military personnel, there was some civilian personnel witnessing this event. The 4 civilians that have been identified were reportedly Franklin Allen of Hearst Newspapers, Edwin Hearst of the Brookings Institute, Gerald Light, who is a metaphysical researcher, and Bishop McIntyre from the Los Angeles Catholic Diocese. Now, Edwards Air Force Base had been closed for 3 days. No one in or out during that time. Witnesses claimed that 3 UFOs flew over the base and landed near the hangar they would be meeting the president in. The president and the aliens met and discussed a treaty wherein the aliens would provide advanced technology for access to resources in the United States. Minerals, people, things like that. And the aliens also provided an ambassador to the U.S. Now, the reaction of the 4 civilian witnesses was judged to be an example of the general public's reaction to seeing and being in the presence of aliens. Based on the reaction of these 4 witnesses, it was decided by all parties to keep this information from the public. Now, Gerald Light eventually put in writing his experience at Edwards Air Force Base that day. That letter can be found on various sites, and also parts of that letter have been referenced in some books written about this event. Others, and military personnel, have discussed and described this event in deathbed confessions and other interviews over the years. However, we have yet to see any official government or military documents, assuming some exist, acknowledging this event. President Eisenhower was eventually flown back to the Palm Springs area and taken back to Smoke Tree Ranch. Now, those are the 2 scenarios. Now, if you believe the official line of the president going to the dentist, does that mean that the alien meeting never happened? Well, not necessarily. Remember, there was some time on Friday afternoon, evening that are extremely short on details, just like the dental trip. So let's visit that time frame. If you recall Friday's calendar entries, after golf and lunch at the Thunderbird Country Club, President Eisenhower was driven to the ranch of aviator Jacqueline Cochran in Indio, California. Now, she was the first female pilot to break the sound barrier. Very famous pilot, right up there with Amelia Earhart. And she had a big ranch out in Indio. That ranch is now part of this country club. I'll show you the Google aerial. Now, looking at the calendar, you can see that Eisenhower left the country club at 2:45 and arrived at Cochran's ranch at 3:10. And after visiting, President Eisenhower left her ranch at 3:45 and next arrived at friend George Allen's estate at 4 p.m. Now, George Allen's estate was in La Quinta, so pretty close by, and it was actually right next door to the La Quinta Resort. Very famous resort. Again, lots of Hollywood elite would stay out at the La Quinta Resort. But this walled and gated compound behind the fire hydrant here, this was George Allen's estate. And this is where, supposedly, President Eisenhower was driven on that Friday afternoon. And this is Avenida Fernando in La Quinta. And La Quinta Resort right across the street. So now President Eisenhower reportedly stayed here for a little over 2 hours, leaving this estate around 6:15 p.m. and heading back to Smoke Tree. Now, as you can see from these calendar entries, there's very few details about who was present during these visits. And if you combine the 2 visits, there's approximately 3 hours of time where the president was offline or out of pocket, whatever you want to call it. So what is near these 2 places, Jacqueline Cochran's ranch and George Allen's estate here? Well, there's an airfield in Thermal. Still is. As a matter of fact, today it's actually called the Jacqueline Cochran Airfield. But back then it was just an airfield out in the middle of nowhere, and certainly large enough to handle the Columbine, the president's plane. Is it possible that President Eisenhower has flown to Edwards on Friday and not Saturday? Remember, the base was locked down during this time. Nobody in and out, and that included Friday. This scenario is suggested in this book by Paul Smith. But this was George Allen's estate. So on Sunday, February 21st at 9:30 a.m., the President and Mrs. Eisenhower attended church services here at the Palm Springs Community Church at 284 South Kauai. The Reverend James Blackstone Jr. presided. So this is where the President resurfaced after having been missing since approximately 8 p.m. the night before. Now the church obviously has had a fire in recent years, but this is where the President and Mrs. Eisenhower came to church services that Sunday. On Sunday, February 21st, around 8:30 p.m., the Eisenhowers hosted a reception here at Smoke Tree for friends, residents, and guests. It was at this reception that the President reportedly introduced Dr. Francis Purcell to the crowd as the dentist who fixed his tooth the previous night. So on Monday, February 22nd, President Eisenhower arrived at Tamara's Country Club around 9:30 for another round of golf with Ben Hogan and Paul Helms. And then again, he had lunch at the country club around 1:20 p.m. So on Tuesday, February 23rd, the President again arrived at Tamara's Country Club around 9:20 a.m. and played another round of golf, this time with a pretty large group of people. This time after his round of golf, though, he went back to Smoke Tree. On Tuesday, February 23rd, around 8:05 p.m., the Eisenhowers and their entourage departed Smoke Tree for the Palm Springs Airport, where they boarded the Columbine and flew back to Washington, D.C. Now, back at Dr. Purcell's former home. In 1991, 37 years after the fact, the U.S. Surgeon General released President Eisenhower's medical and dental records. According to that report, President Eisenhower chipped the porcelain cap of his upper left central incisor, and it was repaired by a Dr. Francis Purcell in Palm Springs. Now, why wait 37 years? And again, there were no notes or records in Dr. Purcell's files regarding this emergency treatment for the President. Also, according to Dr. Purcell's wife, he never mentioned the fact that he treated the President. But again, just all seems kind of put together. And again, why wait 37 years to release a record of a dental visit? Take a look at this calendar entry. So you notice the detailed times. I mean, 7:45, 8:55, 9:10, 9:40, 12:50, 2:45, and the names and, you know, exactly where he was at, all that kind of stuff. And then you look at the dental entry at the bottom. Sometime between 8 and 10, no name of the dentist, no location, no details, no nothing. It's just very interesting that the calendar's full of detailed entries all throughout except for this one entry. Now, there's always been a question about those 6 Georgia State Troopers being part of the Eisenhower security detail for this trip. The author of this book, Paul Smith, found a note in the presidential appointment log for Eisenhower from February 12th, 1955. On that date, almost a year after this trip that we're talking about, the notes in the log state that President Eisenhower autographed a photo taken on February 19th, 1954 in Palm Springs, California, showing the 6 Georgia State troopers who had assisted the Secret Service in setting up security for that occasion. Well, that's going to do it, ladies and gentlemen, for this video about President Eisenhower and his possible meeting with aliens. I encourage you to do your own research. There's certainly a number of other researchers have put forth their argument, pro and con, but you know, Grant Cameron, Richard Dolan, Linda Moulton Howe, Michael Salla. But I encourage you to maybe start with these books, this one by Paul Smith. There's also this book here by Timothy Good, which is a great book you should have in your collection anyway, whether you're looking into this particular event or not. Also, Michael Salla has written a book covering this episode. There's also the movie The 11th Green, starring Campbell Scott, and it's about this supposed meeting. The 11th Green being where Eisenhower lived at the El Dorado Country Club after his presidency. Now I'm going to add one other wrinkle to this story, another rumor that certainly people should be looking into. There's another rumor floating out there that during this trip that President Eisenhower took to the Palm Springs area for a golfing vacation, there's a rumor that former President Harry Truman was also in the Coachella Valley at that time. And the rumor goes on that the meeting or the visit to George Allen's house in La Quinta, right by the La Quinta Resort, that President Eisenhower did on Friday, February 19th. Well, the rumor is that former President Truman was actually at that house, and Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower had a sit down, possibly to discuss the meeting the next day President Eisenhower was going to have with the aliens. Remember, Harry Truman was no stranger to alien issues himself. Remember Roswell, and some of the other episodes from that time frame occurred on Harry Truman's watch. So just something else to chew on, something else to look into, do your own research, come up with your own decision on all this. But I appreciate you taking the time to watch this video, and we have more coming, so stay tuned. Until next time.